lift incomes.
Question number 2. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr Speaker, my question is on behalf of the Right Honourable Bill English to the Prime Minister. Does she stand by all her government's policies and actions?
Mr Speaker.
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, can I begin by congratulating the member and wishing him all the best for his new role as Leader of the National Party? And to answer the question, yes.
Speaker, how many of the projects announced on Friday were projects not already underway or planned under existing government programs?
Mr Speaker.
Order.
We've actually been quite open about the fact that predominantly they had been ones that had pitched themselves to the last government, but obviously were not progressed, were not funded, and it took this government to accept that those regions had produced initiatives that were worth progressing, and so we're making them happen.
Mr Speaker, which region received the most cash in the initial round of projects announced on Friday?
Mr Speaker, I think this early on it would be premature to pick a winner, of course, because it is a $1 billion fund per annum. We have only just started with little over $60 million worth of investment. We always said that we would highlight, for instance, Northland, the West Coast, areas like the Bay of Plenty, wherever there is a lack of investment, high levels of unemployment and deprivation. So we've started with those areas, and that's included places like Northland.
Order. It was quite a specific question, and you did mention 3 regions, and I'm going to ask the Prime Minister just to very briefly address the question again.
Mr Speaker, in this first initial round, there was a dominant feature for Northland, as there should be.
Why is that?
Mr Speaker, because that region was totally neglected by the last government.
How much of the $61.7 million announced last Friday was already appropriated funding from the last government, and how much of it was new money from this government?
Mr Speaker, as I said in the first answer, we've made no secret of the fact that the last government ignored the pitches that were made by those regions that made a strong business case for investment and were ignored. And that's why we decided to progress them. So, Order. Mr Speaker, on the one hand, you can't argue that they were reasonable business cases, but on the other hand, never funded them. They were funded.
So, how much of the $61.7 million announced last Friday was already appropriated funding from the last government, and how much of it was new money from this government?
Mr Speaker, the member is ignoring some of the projects, for instance, on the West Coast.
Order.
The West Coast.
Order.
On the West Coast, for instance, the trails down there were initiatives that were promoted by Damien O'Connor and which were progressed by this government. But as I said, we've acknowledged that the last government didn't progress, predominantly ideas from Northland, which is one of the many neglected regions, and so a good portion of the $60 million is going to them.
How much of the $61.7 million announced last Friday was already appropriated funding from the last government, and how much of it was new money from this government?
Mr Speaker, the billion-dollar fund that this government announced on Friday, of which we've announced a small portion to kickstart us.
Order. I'm sorry to interrupt the member, but the Honourable Amy Adams, I think if it might be an idea just to leave the Prime Minister to answer the question, especially the member will get a chance to finish it, but her interjection has resulted in the opposition getting an additional supplementary. I want to say to Amy Adams, she's quite a long way away, but her voice is dominating at the moment. I would prefer to go back to the answer. Thank you.
Mr Speaker, the vast majority were new allocations. Perhaps the member would like to talk to us about the bridges he was meant to have built as well.
How will the government's provincial fund compensate the regions for all the backwards-looking policies being enacted, such as industrial relations, immigration and red tape restrictions?
Mr Speaker, I have to correct the member. When it comes to issues like the skills gap for our region, this is the one party and government that collectively has said we will allow regional skills migrant lists to respond to the fact that the last government didn't listen to the problems that they had.
Speaker, in light of the government's big spending initiatives in tertiary education and Kiwi Build with no evaluations, why do we now have $3 billion spending on regional development that we'll never know how big a flop it is until 2023 because Labor have made sure there's no evaluation?
Speaker, so on the one hand, these were all your ideas, on the other, they're going to be a flop. The member needs to make up his mind over whether or not the regional growth fund's a good idea.
Why is the Prime Minister comfortable with the Provincial Fund Advisory Panel being headed by a private political donor to Shane Jones and David Parker, the two most important ministers for this policy?
Mr Speaker, I would make the comment that the only reason the member knows about that is because it was declared, it was transparent, and we've made it clear that that donation was made. But I think the member discounts the vast experience of every member of that advisory board, including the person referenced background in investment, exactly the kind of skills we want on that advisory panel.
So, why has the Prime Minister set up a fund that gives the biggest dollop of cash to Winston Peters' home region of Northland, is advised by a private political donor to Shane Jones and David Parker, has an NZ First List candidate on the independent panel, and deliberately has no assessment of its effectiveness until 2023?
Mr Speaker, of course we'll be monitoring the effectiveness of our own policy. But one comment I would want to make is the new leader of the National Party telling Northland that they have no need for investment in infrastructure for their region, because that is a disgraceful claim to make.
Question number 3, the Honourable Jerry Browning.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Foreign Affairs.